Welcome to MMA Weighin Radio. Navid Razi alongside world award-winning journalist for MMA Junkie and USA Today, John Morgan, who's fresh off his return from UFC 153 in Brazil in what was coined a fun fight between Anderson Silva and Stephan Bonnar. And John, I can assure you it was anything but fun for Stephan Bonnar, but more on that here in a little bit once we break down this fight. And let's jump right into it, John. Anderson Silva, he did what he does best, and that's taking professional MMA fighters and making them look like absolute amateurs. And Stephan Bonnar, he did exactly what he wanted to do in the octagon. He was the bigger fighter. He bullied Silva, pushed him up against the octagon, used dirty boxing, elbows, knees, and Silva not only played directly into Bonnar's hand, but even whenever Silva had the opportunity to move and get out of the way, he would lean right back up against the fence and absorb more of Bonnar's shots. And John, we've both seen Silva take punches from guys who are much bigger than him, like Forrest Griffin. But when Bonnar threw that spinning back kick and Silva just kind of casually moved out of the way, looked at where Bonnar's foot was against the octagon, and then moved right back in the same spot, you knew that the end was near for Bonnar right there, and Silva was about to go off.
It's incredible. I mean, as amazing as Anderson Silva is as the UFC middleweight champion, it seems like he looks even better at 205 pounds somehow. And granted, Stephan Bonnar isn't championship caliber contender at this point in his career, but he is a very, very tough individual and a guy that's been in a lot of wars and a lot of, really bloody kind of toe-to-toe fights. And Anderson Silva just handled them. And I think that's really, just a testament to how great Anderson Silva really is. I do think he is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. I do believe he is the best fighter that we've ever seen on the face of the planet. And you just can't say enough about him. I mean, if anything, I guess I just feel bad for Stephan Bonnar. You mentioned that it was a fun fight, and he probably didn't have much fun at it. And it really doesn't seem that way at all. It seems like, talking to some people behind the scenes in Brazil, they said, Stephan, who didn't show up to the press conference, was just heartbroken and kind of embarrassed by his performance. And I got to be honest, Navid, I don't think he really needed to feel that way. I think, the odds were definitely stacked against him. He was doing the UFC a favor, and I think he came in and did all he could do, which was come in and try to make it an ugly, dirty fight up against the cage, try to out-wrestle Anderson Silva, and it just didn't work out. Anderson Silva is just that amazing.
Yeah, I think if anything, the reason he would have been embarrassed was just the way Anderson Silva was just toying with him and saying, I mean, it's funny because Anderson Silva is one of the only guys that I've seen in MMA who can roll with punches the way he does. And that's one of the things that a lot of boxing guys laugh at MMA fighters for, because they say they just absorb all those shots without rolling their chin, and they just take punches cleanly. Where Anderson Silva, I mean, he does look like a boxer in there, but Stephan Bonnar actually tweeted a picture of him connecting with Anderson Silva, and I mean that was a solid shot. So you knew a couple of those shots was going in and hitting Silva very cleanly, but nothing seemed to faze him. And I think what really probably embarrassed Stephan Bonnar the most was the fact that he did have Anderson Silva exactly where he wanted, and Anderson Silva was seeing Stephan Bonnar's shots coming before Stephan Bonnar was even thinking about throwing him. I mean, there was a couple times in the clinch where Stephan Bonnar would go to throw a knee, and Anderson Silva would move out of the way before Bonnar would even throw the knee. Like, he knew it was coming. And then on top of that, Bonnar just kind of getting murdered by one knee from Anderson Silva when he threw 45 punches at Anderson and shots in the clinch, and one shot took him down. So maybe that's why he was embarrassed. But, I mean, on the bright side, he didn't look as bad as Forrest Griffin did, that's for sure.
Oh, that's rough, man. That's a backhanded compliment if I ever heard one. But yeah, I tell you what, it's amazing. First of all, Anderson Silva's ability to absorb punishment. I mean, you said it, but even just the way his body and his skin and his muscle reacts to it. I mean, you think back to the first Chael Sonnen fight when he was kind of being beat up for the better part of 5 rounds, and when the fight's finally over, he looks no worse for the wear. You can't tell he's been in a fight. So it's incredible. I don't know what his body is made out of, but whatever it is, he needs to patent it, man. It's genius. Stitch could use some of that stuff in the corners in between.
Absolutely.
Rounds, man. So it is great. But, you do talk about the head movement and the shoulder rolls and the way he can move his torso. It's just incredible. I think it's, both intelligence and anticipation, because he does seem to see things coming more so than any other fighter in recent memory that just kind of anticipates what's coming. And then to be able to execute it with such speed and creativity and precision, it's amazing. And then to think that he's 37 years old. I mean, so much of Anderson Silva's game is based on his elusiveness, his creativity. It's not, just some big plotting, powerful puncher who can fight well into his 40s because the power is the last thing to go. I mean, this is a man that moves differently than just about anybody out there, other than maybe Jon Jones. So really just an incredible performance, especially, being able to do it in front of his countrymen in Brazil. It's, I've said it before, Navid, but I'll say it again. If fans can find a way to get down to Brazil to see a UFC fight, you just have to do it. The atmosphere is incredible. And Anderson Silva is, so highly regarded in his country. His face was everywhere, on the bus stops there as the face of Nike in Brazil, and it was just a really neat scene, man. So great performance by Anderson Silva. Critics are going to come out and say, why did the UFC make this fight to begin with? It should have never been there. Stephan Bonnar had no business being in there with Anderson Silva and blah, 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 all those things. But, I mean, let's be honest. This was not the original intention. The original intention, the original intention was Aldo and Coke. It turned into a better intention, I thought, with Aldo and Edgar. And, of course, that didn't work out either. So I think the UFC did what they had to do. And Anderson Silva lived up to what he had to do, which was come in and put on a show. And you mentioned it, Navid, but just – I mean, to be up against the cage and to move away from the cage and to be back in the center, and you think, okay, here we go. And for Anderson just to walk right back over to the fence and say, this is where you want me. I'll fight you right here. And his corner's yelling at him, what are you doing? What are you doing? He's just looking over at him. I got this under control. I got this, in the middle of a fight. It's just amazing. So, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I understand maybe, to pay $55. Maybe you can't order every single UFC pay-per-view. Maybe you got to go to Buffalo Wild Wings to watch one every now and then, or have some friends over to chip in, because $55 can get a little expensive. But for me, just the opportunity to watch Anderson Silva fight, I think you got to take advantage of, because we don't know how many he has left.
Yeah.
We don't know.
That's a good point. If you can't afford $55 for every pay-per-view, you better pony up for Anderson Silva, because we don't know how many of these UFCs we're going to see him at. And if I have $55 to spend on anybody, we kind of joke around about Donald Cerrone being a guy that we would actually pay tickets to go see. But for my money, if I'm paying for any fighter to watch on pay-per-view, it's Anderson Silva, hands down. Obviously, he had that Damian Maia fight that a lot of people still bitch and moan about, but everybody has a bad night, and if you want to stack up his ridiculously incredible nights against one of those bad nights, I'll take that any day of the week. But Joe Rogan asked Anderson Silva after the fight, why did you move back against the fence on purpose whenever your corner was yelling at you to get the hell out of there and move around? And his response was, I'm not the best, I just do things that people think are impossible. And then he went on to say he would not fight at 205 pounds, and he only fought there to save the event. But you mentioned this earlier, John, about being the pound-for-pound greatest fighter in the world. And usually I'm not a fan of the pound-for-pound rankings, because in the past, especially the past couple years, the waters have been kind of muddy, and it's kind of hard to say that this guy is a pound-for-pound guy over this guy. But now it has to be clear over the last couple years that Anderson Silva, any argument against Anderson Silva being the pound-for-pound greatest fighter in the world is absolutely stupid. I mean, it makes no sense. In the past, a lot of people said Fedor Emelianenko, George St. Pierre, now Jon Jones is being coined as the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. But people just need to stop all this nonsense. Fedor, obviously, in a heavyweight division that didn't compare to anything that's going on in the light heavyweight or middleweight division now. George St. Pierre, obviously, freakish athlete, not really knocking guys out left and right. He's doing a lot of wrestling, a lot of ground and pound, and people are complaining that before he got injured that he was becoming the John Fitch of that division and not doing anything. And Jon Jones, to me, is the closest guy to pulling off the things that we've seen Anderson Silva do in the octagon. But what Anderson Silva said to Joe Rogan in his post-fight interview about not being the best and he just does things that people think are impossible, I mean, he does do things that aren't possible. Nobody moves the way Anderson Silva moves. Nobody in the history of MMA sees what their opponent is doing, not only before they throw it, but before they're thinking of what they're about to throw. And Silva he does things you see in the movies that we used to think were corny for years, and he's doing those things every single week in the octagon. So the man, to me, he's the god of mixed martial arts, and we kind of joked about this, but everybody calls him the Michael Jordan of MMA, and to me, he's better than Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan had Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, some other guys by his side. Anderson Silva, he's going in there solo and doing things like this. So to me, there won't be another fighter like Anderson Silva probably in our generation. You hear guys in the NBA like Kobe and LeBron James being compared to the next Michael Jordan. We're not hearing anybody say that about Anderson Silva because nobody fights the way he does. And you mentioned 37 years old. Not only has he managed to overcome all these obstacles that he's faced in the octagon, but he's managed to overcome Father Time, and that's something that has, up to this point, has been undefeated. And Anderson Silva somehow has found a way to get past that.
Well, like you said, I mean, you mentioned the criticisms of the fights that he's had. The Damian Maia fight, that's 2.5 years ago. Patrick Cote, that's 4 years ago. I mean, come on, let it go by now. So I do agree with you. I think if there is one man that has the ability, perhaps, and we're getting way ahead of ourselves right now to say it, but to maybe match what Anderson Silva has accomplished in his career, it is Jon Jones. And Jon Jones is still extremely young in his career, of course, and has had an amazing run as of late. But I think Jon Jones has an opportunity to match that just both in his athletic abilities and what he's already accomplished versus what he can accomplish. And for that reason, I hope they do fight. It sounds like if George St. Pierre is able to get past Carlos Condit in November, that George St. Pierre and Anderson Silva will be a potential fight. I like it. I mean, it's a big money fight. I'm not a big fan of the fight itself. I like the fight, the attention it'll probably bring. I'm sure it'll get lots of ESPN coverage and mainstream attention and all these things. But I think people that want to see that fight haven't really had an opportunity to stand next to these athletes. Anderson Silva is a massive 185-pounder. I mean, you look at him at 205 pounds, and he doesn't really look, out of place in the light heavyweight division. Meanwhile, George St. Pierre is a very muscled 170-pounder, but I think he's listed at 5'10". I've stood next to him. I don't even think he's 5'10", to be honest with you. And so I just think the size advantage is going to be massive for Anderson Silva. It is two very dominant champions. I mean, it's George St. Pierre and what he's accomplished. You can't take away his greatness. Obviously, a future UFC Hall of Famer. He's been carrying the torch for Canadian mixed martial arts for so long. But I just don't think his style matches up real well with Anderson Silva. Whereas I think with Jon Jones, it does. We talked about the body type and the movement. Obviously Jon Jones is kind of a lanky, rangy fighter in the way that Anderson Silva is. They're both very creative. They're both very fluid in their movements. And I think that would be a fantastic fight to see at some point. As you said, Navid, after the fight, Anderson Silva said, look, I'm just not into it. I don't want to do this Jon Jones fight. Dana White insisted, hey, I can make this fight happen, and I will make this fight happen if the time comes. And I hope he does. And I think, Dana kind of suggested to me that, maybe this is Anderson Silva's way of negotiating a little bit, just saying, hey, man, I'm not interested. I don't want to do this fight. Well, what if we just back a bank truck up to your house and dump money in your front yard? Will you take it then? And I think that might have to be what it is. But to me, if I'm Anderson Silva, if I'm Anderson Silva's people, I want him to take this fight. And for one reason and one reason alone, and that is legacy. That is, being the best ever. Because, Jon Jones has the ability, I think, unless he beats himself, unless, mentally the strains of being a famous mixed martial artist and a star and all these things get to him, I think Jon Jones can go on a similar type run to Anderson Silva. So if Anderson can beat Jon Jones, then it doesn't matter what Jon Jones does after that. He can win 50 fights in a row. And when me and you were at the water cooler talking about who's the best ever, I win the argument right away by just saying Anderson Silva because Anderson Silva beat Jon Jones.
Yeah.
Again, there's still some things that need to happen between now and then, but I do hope we get to see that fight. I think, it would be an incredible fight for Anderson Silva to retire on. Can you imagine? I mean, right now, most people, depending on how you want to order it up, Anderson Silva, Jon Jones, and George St. Pierre are considered the three best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. How amazing would it be for Anderson Silva to be able to beat the guy below him and beat the guy above him, beat the guys that are, basically considered number 2 and number 3 in the world? What a way to end a career.
Yeah, you mentioned Anderson Silva and the possibility of fighting George St. Pierre. If George St. Pierre can get past Carlos Condit, which is not a given by any means, but to me, this is the way I look at that. I would lose no sleep over Anderson Silva never facing George St. Pierre. It would haunt everybody if Anderson Silva didn't fight Jon Jones. And that's the fight that everybody wants to see. You mentioned that Silva doesn't care about money, and Dana White says the amount of money we're going to offer Silva, he won't be able to say no. But you mentioned also he does care about his legacy, and I think when you combine the two, it's going to be next to impossible for this fight not to happen, especially since we've seen a little bit of waffling from both guys. Anderson Silva, Jon Jones both said they would never fight each other, but in a few articles, they've said Anderson Silva said, well, maybe he would fight Jon Jones if all the fans wanted to see it. And Jon Jones at the same time said, I don't see this as a lose-lose situation anymore. Maybe I do have something to gain from this. So to me, the writing's on the wall that fight has to happen. And as bad as it sounds, it would almost benefit that fight if George St. Pierre lost to Carlos Condit.
Yeah, it would. I mean, I think, man, I haven't heard it put that way, Navid, but I think that's a great way to put it, man. If Anderson Silva GSP never fight, I get over it. You know, I go, oh well, whatever. But if Anderson Silva and Jon Jones don't fight, man, I think I will be disappointed, man. A lot more disappointed than I am that Fedor Emelianenko and Brock Lesnar never fought, or something along that line. I don't even care about that fight. You know, whatever. You know, casual fan would tune in. This is an opportunity to match up two of the greatest fighters we've ever seen. So I hope it happens. And you're right. I think if you want this fight to happen, maybe right now you just become a big Carlos Condit fan and hope Carlos Condit beats George St. Pierre. Because I mean, I honestly think you could still do George St. Pierre versus Anderson Silva even if George lost. I mean, George St. Pierre is the face of Canadian mixed martial arts. Anderson Silva is obviously a hero in Brazil. Those are two MMA crazed countries. You could do the fight in either one of those countries. You could do it anywhere. You could do it in Vegas, anywhere in the United States. It's going to sell well. And I think even if George loses, you could do that fight. But Dana has basically made it known that if George loses, we're not really interested in promoting the fight. And I can see that. I mean, it's obviously wouldn't have quite the attention on it if he were to lose. So, Carlos Condit is a tough fighter, man. This is a big fight for George St. Pierre, especially coming off a layoff. Is there going to be any tentativeness or hesitancy on that knee? Is it going to be any concern whatsoever? Who knows? So, yeah, I guess right now what you end up doing is just becoming a big Carlos Condit fan and hope he can come in and play the Royal spoiler.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, Anderson Silva, for his sake, has to fight Jon Jones first. Reason being, if something should happen and he should lose to Jon Jones, and if let's say he fights George St. Pierre first, wins, and then loses to Jon Jones, then what the hell do you do from there? But if you fight Jon Jones, even if you do lose for him, you have George St. Pierre in the back pocket, and that would be the backup fight for Anderson Silva after he fights Jon Jones. So it makes no sense to me for him to fight George St. Pierre first, wait another year, get another year older and slower, and then fight Jon Jones. So it doesn't make any sense. But to beat this horse to death once and for all, if you don't think Anderson Silva is the greatest fighter on the planet, you're an absolute idiot. And not only should you not be watching MMA, you shouldn't be watching it in general. I mean, if you don't think he's the greatest, you need glasses or LASIK or something. But it's funny because I got kind of fired up about a lot of guys online saying that, of course, Anderson Silva looked good against Stephan Bonnar. He didn't belong in there, and it was a joke of a fight, etc. And saying that Chael Sonnen laid the blueprint on how to beat Anderson Silva, and that's with takedowns and ground and pound. I don't know how good at math these people are, but Chael Sonnen fought Anderson Silva twice, once with broken ribs and on TRT. Another time, both guys were clean. Both times, Chael Sonnen lost. First time by triangle, second time knocked out. So I don't understand what the blueprint is on that. The only people are saying that Jon Jones would easily defeat Anderson Silva just by taking him down and ground and pound. Granted, Jon Jones' ground and pound is a lot different than Chael Sonnen's, but if you look at the stand-up game, if it comes down to it, you have to give the advantage to Anderson Silva by miles.
Yeah, you do. It's funny, too, the people that have kind of hated on Anderson Silva, I have heard this comparison lately, talking about, Jon Jones' incredible run of defeating former UFC champions. There's no former UFC champions for Anderson Silva to beat. I mean, there hasn't been another champion since 2006. I mean, are we clamoring to see him fight Rich Franklin again? Evan Tanner, God rest his soul, obviously has passed on. He can't fight him. Murillo Bustamante and Dave Manet, you don't think Anderson Silva could beat them? So, I just don't think that's a fair argument to make. I understand that, saying Jon Jones' run is more impressive because he's beat former champions. That's, that does sound great, but there haven't been any former champions because Anderson Silva is that good, and I don't think you can take away. I mean, who knows how many former 185-pound champions there would be in the UFC out of the list of guys that he had beat had he not been there. But obviously nobody was able to reach that because he's held gold for so long. So I hate that argument. I've heard it a couple times, and I just think it's a poor argument.
And none of those other former champions should even be mentioned in the same sentence as Anderson Silva anyway. So obviously, but quickly to touch on what Dana White said. He said about Anderson Silva, quote, "I want him to be 27, and I wish there was 12 more years of this. Anderson Silva always makes it look easy." And Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, again, Dana White says he will make that fight happen. And he also went on to say, how many guys in the UFC say a fight won't happen? I won't fight this guy. I won't fight that guy. Anderson Silva has broken every record in the UFC and continues to amaze me. Anderson is one of those guys that loves challenges, and I think he will take the Jones fight. Not to mention, like you said earlier, John, the fact that the money for that fight, it would be hard for either one of those guys to turn that fight down. And usually when Dana White says something is going to happen and guarantees and says things like will and absolutely, it's going to happen. So I think we have a fight to look very forward to, as long as Chael Sonnen and George St. Pierre don't play spoilers.
There you go, man. I tell you what, it's gonna be interesting to see. I hope we see it because, like you said, I don't know how many times left we're gonna left to see Anderson Silva, and it's one of the few that's still special, man. That Ain't No Sunshine song comes on, and the arena's dark, and it's just cool, man. It's Anderson Silva, man. It's one of the few people you really get excited because you're watching a living legend, and I guess it sounds like we're just falling all over this guy, but there's not enough word for me to describe how amazing it is. I mean, just this fight, I understand Stephan Bonnar was a huge underdog. I understand he was overmatched and all that. But you know what? It's like college football. When you're playing those early season games against teams that don't belong in there, you're supposed to blow them out. You're supposed to go in there and prove they don't belong on the field with you. And man, Stephan Bonnar just got absolutely waxed through no fault of his own. I don't think he should hang his head in shame. Anderson Silva is just that good, man. And it's a pleasure to watch him fight. I don't care who it's against.
Yeah, it's absolutely privileged to be watching him fight live in our lifetime. And it's going to go down as one of the greatest fighters in mixed martial arts history. And that's going to do it for us. For the great Anderson Silva, the great John Morgan, Navid Razi, this is MMA Weighin Radio, the end of this webisode. And we will be back with another one of these next week. For now, thanks for checking out MMA Weighin Radio. And be sure to check out John Morgan on USA Today and MMAJunkie.com.